when we dug inside this data, I don't know that it's particularly surprising. If what I'd said to you was, you know what, look, for students who have a 19 ACT score, they did pretty good in freshman math. You know, I bet it would work for a student who have an 18. I think probably everybody in the room goes, yeah, I could believe that. But what about a 17? You know, as I gradually went down the range, probably I'd have more and more people who would be shaking or nodding their heads, depending on whether they were agreeing or disagreeing. And I must admit, what I expected to find as we dug inside this data would be that there would be a change of phase, that there would be a place where students came in, at least their test scores suggested that they came in so poorly prepared that doing something before they went and took that credit-bearing math class would be advantageous for them. That there would be a place where it would flip over, that actually going straight into the credit-bearing class was not as effective as doing the first this, then that. Does that seem reasonable? Yeah, so it's not there. Yeah, we looked inside our data. I know others have looked inside theirs. I know this has been Peter's experience over the years. So you can look for it, and it sort of feels right, but so did the prerequisite idea. That felt right too. It wasn't right. We can now see it wasn't right. And thinking about the fact that at least all the way down, our data goes all the way down to 13 in the ACT, yeah, it isn't there. There isn't a change. You can see students who have a 13, they pass that credit-bearing class at 70%. Yeah, so 12, we actually only had 2 people in the study who had a 12. They both passed. Yeah, so the striking thing is that in the full body of data that we did before, only 1 student passed who had a 12. So only 1 student in our entire system-wide data passed who had a 12. So it was a 2% success rate. But we only had 2 people in the study, and both of them passed. So this is really kind of really quite striking. What I think is pretty striking is, for instance, the 13 and 14. Why do you think the success rate for a 13 is more than the success rate for a 14? I mean, strikingly more. So I have a theory about this. It's not a tested theory, but it's fun to think about. You get 13, you're pretty likely to get a 13 if you Christmas tree the test. You're very unlikely to get a 14 if you Christmas tree the test. So it's probably the case that a 13 is a less accurate assessment of that student's preparation than the 14 is. The trouble is that we are deciding students' futures by this test that they don't even realize is a test that they are taking for that sense. Very interesting email I saw yesterday. ACT actually sent out an email saying that they are going to phase out, let me say it again, they are going to phase out the ACT Compass test as a placement tool. ACT is going to phase that out. They're going to spend the next year trying to figure out how to create a new tool, and largely, I think it's not unreasonable to imagine that it's in response to this kind of discussion, that recognizing that you cannot, with any comfort right now, say, no, you're a student who, I mean, these students who had a 13, we've increased their success rate from 2% to 70%. What kind of security was that? So yeah, it doesn't just work for people around the cut. It works for everybody. It works for everybody.
I asked you this a couple years ago.
Yeah. Well, a couple of years ago, Hunter Boylan at NAID wrote an article in their journal in which he asserted that ALP works pretty well. But then if he'd stopped there, I would have been really happy. But he went on to say, for students close to the cutoff. And I've heard that Hunter wasn't the first person to say that. So once we saw that article, we got our institutional research office to generate some data for us. And let me explain that at our school, 35% of the incoming students are placed in credit English, which of course means 65%, how's that for math, are placed in developmental writing. And of that 65%, 87% of them are placed in the upper level course, and 13% are placed in a course we call English 051 at a lower level. Of those 87% who are placed in the upper level course, all of them are eligible for ALP. So we don't only let students close to we let everybody who's placed in our upper level course, which is 87% of our developmental writers. So what did we find when we looked at how they did? Well, at the bottom you can see we've got again, I apologize, but we do use AccuPlacer. And of students in the top 10 points, 80 to 89, you can see that their performance was improved, was doubled from 33 to 65%. For students in the middle range, about the same. And for students at the bottom, again, about the same. They started a little lower, but their improvement is actually more than double. And so, you know, unless you think 87% of our students are close to the cutoff, then it's not true that it's only works for students close to the cutoff. When we started ALP, I was actually arguing that we ought to limit it to the upper half of developmental students because I wanted to make sure it would work, and I was hedging my bets. And a colleague of mine, Bob Miller, said, Peter, if you do that, you'll never find out about the students in the lower half. And it turns out not only was he right, but the students in the lower half are actually having more success. If I had to do triage, I would give them ALP rather than the ones close to the cutoff. Finally, about the ones that are placed in the lower level course, I'm not in charge of such decisions, but if I were, I would put them in ALP also. You know, my school hasn't had, and I don't know of anybody who's gone all the way to a 12 on the ACT, but I'd love to hear from anyone who has let that very bottom group of students into an ALP-like program to see how they're doing. I think they can't do any worse. Right now their success rate is 13%. One last thing that I wanted to say, I mentioned in my formal presentation that 200 schools around the country are now doing ALP, but I forgot to say the most important thing. Of those 200 schools, not one of them is doing it exactly the way we do it. One of the strengths of ALP is that it's a very malleable model. What I described in my presentation is the way we do it at CCBC, but there are all kinds of variations on that. And we have a study that was just completed by Achieving the Dream of 7 schools around the country, small rural schools, large urban schools, southern schools, Midwestern schools, schools on the East Coast, and each of those are having the same kind of success as we are, and they're using a variety of different models of ALP. So I didn't want to leave you with the impression that it was a sort of, you had to buy it lock, stock, and barrel or it wouldn't work. We don't argue that at all.
A good way to think about this, and I was in a meeting a week or so ago about this, and they kept pressing me the same questions that we've been asking Peter and Tristan. Well, what about those that are at the lowest level? And I said, so what are you telling me that works better for those students at the lowest level than this? And there's no answer. There's absolutely no answer. And so the alternative to this is to do worse. At least if you do this, you can't do worse than we're currently doing. And you're more likely to do substantially better because we've not figured out, no one's figured out a way for students, even at the lowest level, to do better. And so there's not an alternative. And so even if, rather than a quadruple or a double, even if it's a 50% improvement, those students are still better off in this kind of a strategy than what they're currently doing.
One of the things we're doing in Tennessee is, and this is, I guess, now year 3 of the sales program. Is that, in our state, everyone takes the ACT as a junior in high school. And so this is, again, a program that was pioneered actually at one of our community colleges to work with the high schools that when if a student is bound for college but their ACT score was placing them that they would be in some kind of remediation, instead in that 4th year of math to take in that high school math class, take a course which actually prepares them in that way, that satisfies those same kind of learning competencies that we've been talking about. So they developed what's now called the sales program, and this has now got statewide. So our the legislature has actually written this in as a line item in the budget to provide support, and there's a very significant now proportion of high schools in Tennessee that are offering that. And the most recent results were that 80% of the students who began in that sales program this last fall, they actually satisfied all of that remediation as part of their high school experience. So now those students will walk straight into college and they will have settled all of that work and now will be prepared. And of course, this is a way in which we can have sort of our cake and eat it too. The idea about having people better prepared is not a bad argument. Of course, it's the case that we would prefer people to be better prepared. What's odd is the fact that if you make it as part of this sort of pipeline, that if you make it an attrition point, then you actually create more problems than you solve. By embedding it as part of the high school experience, you don't do that. And so this has been a very significant way in which in Tennessee we've then been able to work with those students who otherwise would have been probably towards the bottom of that ACT spectrum.
Peter, could you address, and then we need to kind of wrap this one up, could you address how you convince faculty members and administrators that might be skeptical, of which there are many?
What do you mean, faculty members who are skeptical? What kind of faculty have you been hanging around with? Let me say this. The best argument we've made has been the data that I presented to you all today. The most convincing argument, most faculty have no idea how well their current program is working or how badly, and they have no idea how easily that can be improved just by changing the model. So that's been our strongest argument. One of the things that at my particular school was also a very important argument was I had an old friend who was one of my biggest skeptics about ALP when we first started, Sandra Grady, and I needed 5 sections to run the first semester, and I couldn't find a 5th faculty member, so I twisted Sandra's arm. I actually called in an old debt, and I said, Sandra, you've got to teach a section of this. And she said, I listened to your presentation, I watched your fancy charts, I don't believe it'll work. I don't think those students can handle credit English. And I said, I know all that, but will you do it? And so she did it. At the end of the semester, we met around my dining room table, and I went around the table and I said, would everybody just say a 1 or 2 sentence summary of how the semester went, starting over here. Sandra was sitting over here. And so we went around the table, and finally we got to Sandra, and in her fierce way, she beetled her eyebrows, and she looked at me, and she said, Peter, I told you I didn't think this would work, and you know I've been teaching at this school for more than 30 years, and this is the best teaching experience I've ever had. This is what I went into teaching for in the first place. And I think that's been the second most convincing argument, is that for faculty, it is depressing to teach a course semester after semester in which half your students have disappeared by Thanksgiving. To teach a course where you start with 10 students and 9 of them are successful is really very attractive. So that's been the second, the fact that teaching this model is really satisfying to a faculty member has been, and the faculty who taught it in those early years have been really good ambassadors of that.